And in for participants, you'll be using the chat box feature of Zoom, which you can access on the bottom toolbar of the Zoom screen. And so if you have questions or you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, please just use the chat feature and I'll help address those as we go. I don't see any questions coming in, so I'm making the assumption that everybody is good on their technology side. So I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the February Animal Care Wednesday webinar. Today our topic is antibiotic stewardship and resistance, and we've got Dr. Mike Apley from Kansas State University, and his area of focus really is in antibiotic resistance, more on the feedlot beef side, and he teaches a lot of clinical pharmacology courses at K-State. So I'll let him talk briefly about his main role and then get right into his presentation. Couple of housekeeping things. As you know, with the chat box, you can type at any time. Make sure that if you have any concerns to use that feature and we'll get them addressed, and then we'll answer questions either during or at the end as Dr. Apley finds appropriate. We will keep everybody muted, so please be considerate if you do tune in via phone. Make sure that you mute your phone, and then we'll keep the feedback to a minimum. So Dr. Apley, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Heidi, and welcome everybody. So this is this is my life anymore, is antibiotic stewardship, the use of antibiotics in food animals and across multiple food animal species. Last week I had the opportunity and the privilege to again be involved in the Presidential Advisory Council on Combating Antibiotic Resistant Bacteria, where I serve as a voting member, and there are 15 of us as voting members and another 10 liaison members, and between liaisons and voting members we have 5 that really represent veterinary medicine and agriculture. So it's really been a well-balanced discussion. I've learned a lot, and it just highlights the issues that we're running into from the human side. It's very fascinating to sit in with infectious disease physicians and others as we discuss these problems from both sides. And one of the first things to say is that if anyone thinks that we're not addressing the issue on the human side, that's just incorrect. They really are. And then Friday I had the opportunity to attend our Kansas hospital-acquired infection and antimicrobial resistance working group and sat at a table with microbiologists, infection prevention specialists, hospital managers, infectious disease physicians, and we've got challenges, and we'll cover some of those. So what I elected to do today was take some 30,000-foot views and then diving down deeper in some areas, but hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions. And since I'm not seeing the chat box sitting here at my laptop, I'll have Heidi jump in at any time if you have questions or comments, and we can discuss those. And if we don't get through every slide, why, the world certainly doesn't come to an end. So there's some big changes in food animal antibiotic use which really highlight the pressures, if you will, or societal movements, attitudes, and discoveries. And the first one is, of course, everyone on this call would be well aware of how the uses of antibiotics in food animals are authorized and how they've changed. And the Veterinary Feed Directive starting here on January 1 has really brought out a lot of issues. And one of the common comments from veterinarians when I'm discussing with them the issues of the Veterinary Feed Directive and how we do this is that, I had no idea what some of my clients were doing with antibiotics in the feed, and primarily the tetracyclines. So, of course, the VFD should be familiar subjects for everyone in here, and still going back to the concepts of no extra-label use allowed in major species, no use for growth promotion, and now the FDA is looking for comments on areas where there are feed antibiotics approved with no specified duration of administration. So these are for anaplasmosis, respiratory disease, enteric disease in calves, and I'm missing one. But so that's the next thing that we're starting the round in of looking at that. Of course, all medically important antibiotics now require a prescription for use. So the feed stores that used to sell 10-gram oreomycin crumbles and water-soluble sulfas and tetracyclines either have moved to receiving prescriptions for the water and VFDs for the feed, or have gotten out of the business. And the only thing they would still have as far as antibiotics would be the remaining over-the-counter penicillins and long-acting tetracyclines. So Pen-G, LA200 biomycin, maybe Tylan injectable. Those would be the ones they could still sell without a prescription. And those probably have a 3 to 5 year horizon before they're also prescription. So here's one of the really big things that's coming home to veterinarians is they're not only going to be responsible for essentially all antimicrobial use in food animals, they're also going to be accountable. And there's a lot of issues out there that continue to rise as we're looking at the uses. And veterinarians are realizing that the accountability is sometimes tough. For example, free choice medicated minerals have not been regulated for 20 years. And there are a large variety of unapproved mineral feeds containing chlortetracycline with a clear intention of being fed on a free choice basis that are now being called hand fed, with the intent that the veterinarian would write the VFD for hand fed, knowing that that's not the way it's going to be fed. And I'm really disappointed with the way this has come together, and that the response of a lot of feed companies was to just expect the veterinarian to write that VFD, knowing that that's not the way it's going to be fed as a regulatory document. And we can circle back to that, but that's probably been the basis of 60 to 70% of my questions and interactions with veterinarians has been about free choice feeds and the approval. So here's the checklist for the veterinarian with a VFD. The valid VCPR, which is in almost all states, fits the state definition. Is there a reason to use the product, or is it just habit? And as veterinarians have discovered some of the uses that their clients were routinely doing, such as, just insisting that they have CTC in the mineral cows year round, or some pretty aggressive post-weaning practices. It's bringing this discussion to light, and it's bringing a pretty good crash of tradition versus what the science is. It has to be labeled for a major species. It has to be exactly as per the label, and there's no extra label use except for minor species. So when you get into chuckers, pheasants, quail, deer, bison, those things are those you can use Compliance Policy Guide 615.115 to authorize extra label use of an in-feed regimen labeled for another species. For the birds, it has to be another avian. For mammals, it has to be another mammal. For fish, it has to be approved in another fish species. But that's brought up some challenges in those minor species. The efficacy is a challenge because for some of these labels, they were done in the 60s or 70s when the level of evidence required for efficacy, et cetera, was drastically different than it is today. So this is being a challenge for us to try to actually bring evidence-based approaches into saying if it is. The residue issues, if it is in a minor species, you can only do that within the VCPR if the veterinarian can say, yes, there is adequate information to provide an extended withdrawal period, and that usually comes from the Food Animal Residue Avoidance Data Bank. In a major species, that's why we stick right on the label. And antibiotic resistance is something we're being challenged with, but for a veterinarian to say it's effective, it's legal, it's indicated, but there's some concern this could select for resistance, so we're not going to treat these animals. That's really highly unlikely and will most likely come through regulatory channels, or unfortunately, as we get more and more food retailers trying to set up a better than you marketing system, we're seeing some restrictions there that some are thought through and some that aren't. And the other thing is that they're extrapolating from chickens to cattle or pigs, where, you know, a 38, 42-day-old chicken going to slaughter for the 3.85 or 4 pounders, that's drastically different in time of disease pressure, disease exposure than a pig or a feeder steer. So here, you know, what are we actually doing? And these are the 2015 sales data for antibiotics that are sold in the United States that have some type of food animal application on the label. So this puts everything together, both medically important and non-medically important. And so the ionophores are non-medically important, and they make up like around 40% of the total sales, and tetracyclines are close to that, and of course they are medically important. So those two really stand out. So if you come here, we'll see how good I was. Yeah, okay. Percent of grand total, the ionophores are 30%. So if you're looking at not currently medically important down here, I'll get my cursor on here, the not currently medically important, the ionophores are about 81% of that class, 30% of total. Tetracyclines are 44% of total, and they are 71% of the medically important. Excuse me. So that quickly shows you how dominated we are by tetracycline use. And before this last year, I wondered, where are all those going? And just between us, it's everywhere. There's a lot of use that veterinarians didn't even know where they're going, pervasive in mineral and feeds. We had practices in feedlots, for example, where nutritionists were recommending that the entire yard be pulsed every 30 days, which is illegal. It was then, it is now, and put a whole boatload of the tetracyclines on there. And one of the things, you know, I figured up the price the other day using a $94 a bag price for 50 gram per pound chlorotetracycline product, the type A medicated article. It costs about 94, 96 cents for a 5-day run of the gram per 100 high-end dose of chlorotetracycline in a calf. I mean, it's just, the cost is minimal to do it. The cephalosporins and fluoroquinolones here are two that really get a lot of attention, and their actual percentages are like 0.2% of the grand total. They're really, really small. They just list them as less than 1% here. These are two of the most critically important antibiotics in human medicine, those classes, and we just don't use very much. And of course, it's important to always point out they're not used in water or feed. They're only administered to individual animals by injection. So we did have a fluoroquinolone approved for poultry, but it went off the market in 2006. So here's the another slide showing how we are split between feed and water. So you can see that of the medically important antibiotics, 74% go through the feed, 21% through the water, so 95% went through feed or water. And when you come down here to look at trends that are happening, you can see that the tetracyclines have raised every year, and all I can tell you is that line is going to bend sharply upward for 2016 because there were a huge amount of fire sales on the tetracyclines, preying on fear and just a general, I don't know, whatever, but they really sold the heck out of the stuff in the last month and a half of 2016. So it's going to cause that arrow to go sharply upward because this is based on sales. The good news is 2017 is going to be the first year we have a downtrend probably. And I don't have the numbers to back that up, but just from talking with people and anecdotal reports, I think that's probably what's going to happen. So for domestic use, how much did we change? And the black line in the middle splits this table from the actual report, which gives you a 2010 through 2014 in the middle. But if you look at the percent change from 2009 to 2015, the only thing down is the sulfas and the non-individually reported. Tetracycline's up 31%, penicillin's up 35%, cephalosporin's up 61%, but it's a small number compared to the others. But if you look at the tetracyclines, we've increased the use by 1/3, and that's in total kilograms sold from 2009 through 2015, and we certainly haven't increased our animal numbers that much. So that's a question that's being asked, is where that's going, how's that being controlled? Well, now all of it's going to be controlled by veterinarians through prescriptions or VFDs. So you can see the ones that bring up some flags there. So again, if you look at feed, there's what's happened within feed use. Water over here has been fairly stable the last few years, but in-feed use has continued to rise, and that rise is dominated by in-feed use of the tetracyclines. Then again, here's the medically important. Of the medically important themselves, how much is by feed, and that's 26% has gone up in the feed, and water use has gone up 41%. It's plateaued in the last few years, but had some earlier great rises. So our use has gone up quite a little bit. More of a plateau from 2004 to 2015 in that right column, but our use over the six-year period has been pretty clear, the pattern there, feed and water use. So all of those are now under the control of a veterinarian, and as you can imagine, I guess I would best describe it as driving over a cattle guard at 70 miles an hour, only the cattle guard's about a mile long, as the transition would probably be described. A little bumpy, but we're getting there. There's a lot of good questions out there. I think veterinarians are really striving to do a good job with it, and hence all the questions and discussion. The other thing that's happening is social media and marketing campaigns are drivers of public perception. Form a little further beyond guidance 209 and 213 to say that there will be no over-the-counter sales of antibiotics for food animals in California. Even the ones still labeled as over-the-counter will require a veterinary prescription in California, and that no uses of prevention for prevention, essentially, of medically important antibiotics. Still control and still treatment, but no prevention. And exactly how they split between those categories, I'm not aware. They have told us yet. But para, DART, PAMTA, those were national legislation attempts. Some of them have been repeatedly put in over the years and never gotten out of committee. The ADUFA, the Animal Drug User Fee Act, is in fact one that is passed and is routinely repassed when it needs to be reauthorized. And that's the one that requires that the sales of antibiotics be reported. And speaking of antibiotic reporting, at K-State, we were working with University of Minnesota to quantify antibiotic use in feedlots and dairies. We're doing 32 dairies and 30 feedlots in a pilot study over 5 years. And it's a sample of convenience, not a sample that's designed to statistically represent food animal production in the U.S., but it's working through how we might do this for actual use data and working through the issues and the resources needed. 2 other individuals in a private grant are working on poultry and swine. So regulation, we've talked about the VFD coming in and the removal of growth promotion uses of medically important antibiotics. Of course, that's guidance for industry 209 and 213, leading to the Veterinary Feed Directive. The Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act. Last year we celebrated 20 years of the regulations being in effect for that. So that's been a long time ability of veterinarians to use antibiotics off-label when appropriate. And then the extra-label use prohibitions of fluoroquinolones, and then the prohibition of off-label regimens for cephalosporins, although you can use them for different indications. So cephalosporins is basically Naxel, Lexinel, and Exceed, and fluoroquinolones would be Baytril and Advocin. And then I call this next one retailation, where we have retailers getting in on the act of really trying to position themselves to use antibiotic use as an opportunity for market share. And some of them have thought things out pretty well, and some of them have jumped on the bandwagon of really trying to degrade others so that they can try to get additional market share. And we could spend the rest of the day and the rest of the week talking about their different approaches and what they're trying to do. But it's obviously, I think if people were going to wake up tomorrow and find that we have entire classes of antibiotics taken away from our ability to use them, the lower right there on retailation is much more likely to do it than legislation. And on the legislation part, the California Senate bill, to me, illustrates that we're a lot more likely to see big advances or changes in laws on the state level than the national level. And I learned a new term in DC last week that scares me to death, and that is the term policy entrepreneurs. Think about that for a while. That's kind of interesting. So the Overton window describes what we're doing here, and this is how a gentleman with the last name of Overton put forth a political theory on how things advance in society, and this is how it works. And so it starts out as unthinkable and goes to policy, and we could spend a lot of time talking about things that have moved through society and are moving through it today. But right now, the prohibition of growth promotion uses of medically important antimicrobials is policy. Everyone's taken it out of their labels on a voluntary basis, so that's done. Prohibition of prevention and control uses, well, they've taken away prevention in California. And, you know, a lot of people look at that, and we'll talk about why in another slide, but it's really the concept that the reason you need to use things for prevention and control, use antibiotics, is because of the nature of your production system, and changing the production system would alleviate those needs. And therefore, if we take those away, that forces you to change the production system. That's the logic as best as I can decide it. But most of us on this call, I imagine, would think that prohibiting therapeutic uses of medically important antimicrobials for our animals under our care is unthinkable. But there is a place where that is policy, and that's called organic. So we do have production in the United States where it is prohibited to use antibiotics for any of these uses, including treating acutely ill animals. And of course, the strategy is to move them out into a parallel production system for conventional production. I hate the term conventional, but I'm struggling for a better one. But this is where we're going, and we have some discussions here at K-State. I do with the students about when we start thinking about organic, we have to be careful that we don't fall into the assumption that this means that none of them get sick and actually need treated. So it's a balance, and this is something that we're working in along this scale. I just throw this in to use a quote from a friend of mine, Guy Lonergan. He said one day that if you understand antibiotic resistance, it hasn't been adequately explained to you. And it just highlights the fact that a lot of policy and a lot of marketing decisions are going to be made based on the precautionary principle that is well established in regulatory references in the European Union, and one thing that the European Union wants to export. And as defined in Europe, what that says is when there's enough evidence to suggest there could be a problem, regulatory agencies and legislative bodies are fully justified in going ahead and removing what might be causing a problem until it can be shown to not cause a problem, which is almost an impossible level of evidence. So it's really obvious there are differing perceptions on how antibiotics fit in the grand scheme of treating infectious disease. And so if you start out with my confusogram slide, this really puts it into perspective, I think, of where the antibiotic issues fall. So if we have disease, the animal, and the therapy, and those three together are going to work together to decide the disease outcome. So you can go out a level and talk about all the different components of these different parts. I think everyone on this call could probably sit down and write a slide like this about, well, here's the things that matter. So, you know, the disease, the pathogen, the location of the disease, and the progression when we intervene. The animal is affected by the husbandry, all of the ways it's managed, et cetera. Its immune system status, the physiological state. So you can go out again and start talking about all the things that have an effect on each one of these bars, and it gets really complicated. But you look at the husbandry, the stress we place on them, the biosecurity, the environment they're raised in, and that stress involves production. I mean, look at our average carcass size now compared to 20 years in feeder cattle. Look what a dairy cow is putting out compared to 20 years ago. Huge raises in efficiency, which come from getting a lot more performance, both in speed and amount, from each animal. Of course, our immune system, the physiological state, there's the production level down there, which interacts with stress above, and then all the things about antibiotics, which is my specialty area. And so this yellow line over there on the left really shows what we're talking about for antibiotics. We're linking the regimen of the antibiotic to the susceptibility of the pathogen to that regimen. And that's one interaction amongst all of these other things. So this red side really becomes the interaction between the disease and the therapy. And I would contend that that is judicious use of antibiotics. Adding the part in yellow here on the right makes it stewardship, and that means we do everything possible in that area to make it so that we don't have to use the antibiotics. And the question is, when you start talking about prevention and control, is don't you have to deal with the judicious use because of what you do to the animal over here on the right side with the husbandry, etc.? That's really the question, because sometimes we get into the tack of justifying the fact that we use these antibiotics because they make a difference, when that's really not the core question. The core question is, why do you have to use them to make a difference? What's going on? It's one thing to talk about a cow out in the pasture with a case of foot rot. I need to be educated on how we could change that. You know, you can change how you have drainage around the tanks, and you can change those types of things and try to make it less mud, less opportunity for those feet to be, have lesions in between claws from trauma and then be in the mud. Those types of things, true, you can. But it's still a totally different deal than a load of high-risk calves coming to Kansas from southeast U.S. that were weaned on the truck, commingled with 50 different sources on a 100-head truck. And so when they start asking about our production system there, they got a reason to ask about that. So we also have some new tools to evaluate the relationship between food-animal antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance in human medicine. And this is a huge thing. I'm sitting here talking to you today with levofloxacin circulating through my system for a cellulitis on my arm that got started in an argument with me and an Osage orange tree, which I dropped on our place and was cutting up for wood on Sunday. And I won temporarily, but it got its lick in. And so the ability to just go in and get an antibiotic for that cellulitis with a high assurance that it's probably going to work. And sure enough, it did yesterday, and it's a lot better today. So the antibiotic worked. We've gotten used to that. And as a matter of fact, it'd be about 105 years ago now. Well, 107 years ago, we didn't even have anything other than the newly released arsenic derivative arsphenamine, salvarsan. In 2012, they improved it a little bit. But, 105 years ago, all we had for infectious disease, like my cellulitis, if it kept going, I would have been taking an arsenic derivative with the goal that it would get the bacteria before it got me. And we've come a long way, but we've become a little complacent in just relying on that. So here's the big question: is food animal use a contributor to resistance in human medicine? That's the big question. So let's talk about resistance challenges in human medicine. And I use this. You'll notice I took that picture in 2013, and that was immediately after Kyle was on the 13th of that year. My son had an injury to his leg, a very serious one, and they were using this to control for vancomycin. And then the next year, he came in and got vancomycin, or got methicillin-resistant Staph aureus in that site. So this was a bag. You can see his name up there, upper left, Kyle, that was hanging on his bedside. And luckily, the MRSA he had was still susceptible to vancomycin. Its MIC was higher than it should have been, the minimal inhibitory concentration, but it would still work, so they had to up the dose and carefully monitor his kidneys. And what antibiotic resistance really means is that you don't get the correct antibiotic until later because the first one didn't work. In some cases, like the colistin-resistant organisms or carbapenem-resistant organisms, sometimes there isn't an option for treatment. In many cases with resistant organisms, it means a delay getting to the correct one or a very limited selection of ones that can work. So this comes from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that are their list of 18 of the biggest threats to human health from antibiotic resistance. So there's a lot of these here where to say there's a direct route from humans to, or from food animals to humans would be a pretty big leap. So, but these two I've got highlighted here, the Campylobacter and the Salmonella, at least sometimes those can get through the food chain and get to people. So that's the one question. The other question is, well, what about the reservoir of resistance? What about us selecting for resistant organisms out in animal agriculture and then those pass to people through the food chain or through direct contact or through the environment? And then those resistance genes lie awaiting opportunity in our intestinal flora, and then when we take antibiotics, they flare up, and here we have a problem. And to answer that question, probably not for many, many years, and then I'll refer back to our previous conversation on the precautionary principle, which that's where we decide how much perceived risk there is and how we should act. So if we go to the next slide here, these are the others. So Salmonella, typhi, which is typhoid fever, that's not a Shigella, MRSA. There can be some MRSA go back and forth between animals and people. MRSA goes back and forth between pets and their owners. It's been well proven. MRSA can be in pigs. It's ST398, the type 398, which can colonize people readily that work with pigs. But as far as being a very big part of these 80,000 invasive infections and 11,000 deaths every year, ST398 would be maybe 2 or 3 cases of that, if that, in the cases, and the deaths would have to be in someone incredibly immunocompromised. So very, very, very small piece of that. So much of that MRSA is from human use and spread in the community. The year Kyle got his MRSA, which was probably contracted playing basketball, 3 other teammates had MRSA, 2 during football and 2 during basketball. So it's very ubiquitous out in the population. So if you look at these 2 million cases estimated and 23,000 deaths and add in Clostridium difficile, makes it about 2.3 million and about 37,500 deaths. Maybe some part of 400,000 between Salmonella and Campylobacter, and we wouldn't be all of those. And the deaths, those two account for 60 deaths total. And so this isn't to trivialize that in any way, but it's to put in perspective that yes, I think food animals do have a direct relation through the food chain, direct cause, a really small piece of the overall pie. The question of whether or not it's part of establishing a resistance reservoir that contributes, I don't know. So here's the challenge. So we've got consumer safety over here on the left, and we're going to talk about risk from direct consumption of food and from environmental transfer of resistant organisms that could be selected for in food animals. Oops, wrong arrow. So metrics, how we would evaluate it. On direct consumption, we can look at foodborne bacterial outbreaks, and there have been a couple in the U.S. that were due to multi-drug resistant salmonella in hamburger and in ground turkey, pretty dang rare. Resistance in these outbreaks are something we could look at, and illness, hospitalizations, deaths linked to consumption. And then it is capable of a quantitative risk assessment where we actually try to put numbers to the risk. There's some pretty big assumptions, and we may not agree on them. And then even when we do, we come out and say, well, like for Campylobacter that was fluoroquinolone resistant arising from chickens, the big FDA risk assessment said that if you get a Campylobacter from chicken and it's fluoroquinolone resistance, and fluoroquinolones, it's like ciprofloxacin, were used as your first treatment, you were going to have 2 days more of diarrhea than if it was fluoroquinolone susceptible. And so that was deemed as unacceptable by some. And so even when you can get a quantitative risk assessment, agreeing on what's acceptable or not is another task. But now this environmental side is termed the reservoir of resistance. It's non-foodborne exposure. It's the question of residue effect on gut microbiota, which is the gut bacteria we have, which outnumber our body cells and which can harbor significant resistance that we never even know about. And it's also about maintenance and spread of resistance in the community. And this is not really well suited for quantitative risk assessment. So it becomes, if you could show us there could be an issue, then we need to get rid of them. And that's really a debate here in this country. So finally, a really big change is, I think, with veterinarians involved now in authorizing 95, 96% of the antibiotics by weight in the United States that are used in food animals that we weren't before. So that's in feed antibiotics that are medically important, and in the water, there's an expectation of stewardship. So this is really the punchline for the presentation of this is where I think we have to go and what we have to demonstrate. So the veterinarian first has the responsibility for establishing appropriate diagnostics for this is what the problem is, and then a functional case definition where the client can say this is respiratory disease, this is foot rot, this is pink eye, and agreeing that an antibiotic is needed. So then you enter a cycle where you ask, is there a non-antibiotic alternative which will prevent, control, or treat this disease challenge? Can I do it with vaccines? Can I do it with environment? Can I do it with genetics? Can I do it with production pressure? Can I do it with biosecurity? Are there different ways we can do that? And we are expected to do that first. Now we get into really what I consider judicious use of an antibiotic. The upper two are stewardship. That's doing everything we can to avoid the use of an antibiotic. And then stewardship also includes these steps, which is judicious use. So we need an antibiotic that's been demonstrated to be safe and effective for this purpose and isn't just being used out of habit, while assuring use of the antibiotic is shown to be safe and effective, and that requires protocols. And it involves being involved enough with the client or a production system to actually evaluate how the protocol is being adhered to, and also how to see if there's protocol drift, and that does happen. So you're always still asking, is this antibiotic intervention still necessary? And if not, we stop. If yes, right back to that stewardship cycle of, is there a non-antibiotic alternative? This is what we're being asked to do. And some people feel that by taking away our options in number 3, they force number 2, as if we don't want to do that. That's the friction. That's where people are seeing, like the California Senate bill, that bill also requires antibiotic use reporting within the state. And so by requiring use reporting and starting to take away options, some feel they can force us to solve things through number 2. So if we want to keep antibiotics, I think veterinarians should have control of all uses of antimicrobials in animals, including the ones that are currently over the counter in the farm supply stores, etc. We have to do that. We must practice true stewardship, as shown before in the slide we just looked at. There's a lot of work to be done on duration of therapy. So here's the clinical pharmacologist coming out. All of these drugs have been approved by selecting different doses for the same time exposure and seeing which one works best. And for some of our in-feed ones, it wasn't even that rigorous way back when. And this same thing's happened on the human side, and they've done a lot of work now looking at urinary tract infections on people, and the Cochrane database review on that would show that If they're just going after symptomatic cure, 3 days is as good as 7 days. If you're going to actually try to clear the bacteria, which is questionable if you need to do that, but if that's the goal, you go for 7. Respiratory disease in people. I looked at 8 studies where they looked at a short versus a long course of duration, like 3 days or 5 days versus 7 to 10, depending on the studies. And in none of the cases were they able to demonstrate a benefit to the longer cases and longer treatment. So obviously it depends on the individual, their immune status, the bacteria, all different kinds of things. But these were in case-controlled randomized studies. So we're seeing more and more evidence that we've probably treated for too long. My fluoroquinolone prescription for my arm I'm looking at here is 10 days. And that was based off of an empirical guess by my physician that 10 days would probably be appropriate to make sure that this cellulitis was absolutely cleared up before we stopped. And it feels better and looks better today already. Could we stop at 3? Could we stop at 5? Where do we balance between making sure that this doesn't come back to minimizing fluoroquinolone use in the human population? If it was 5 instead of 10 over 1,000 people, we just knocked down 5,000 days of antibiotic exposure. So that's the kind of things we're struggling with. And our emphasis on prevention of infectious disease can't be just lip service to it. And for us to say as producers and veterinarians that we're using antibiotics judiciously without being very clear about what we're doing to prevent them isn't a very good approach. And protocols and records, the days of chalk marking feedlot steer to show that it had been treated or just taking a nip out of the tag are gone. And veterinarians need to have written protocols with their producers. And you know what? It takes 2 to tangle, and producers have to understand that veterinarians should be compensated for that. It's not an unreasonable expectation to expect from our consumers and from the public and legislators and regulators that we have a defined plan for using antibiotics and that we also monitor that that's how it's being done. And that's where the veterinarian is being thrust into as we go into this era of increased veterinary oversight. So there are some things that just aren't true. I want to make sure everyone understands. This gets out there, and we have multiple extension people on this call or this webinar. I'd really like you to help with this. This is absolutely untrue. At the slaughter withdrawal time, that is based on a tolerance, which is an acceptable concentration that is safe based on toxicology, and only very recently on some very recent approvals does it consider the potential to select for antibiotic resistance. But this is out there. National Chicken Council has this on their website. I hear some industry people saying this, and I've read that in some agricultural advocates' blogs and heard them speak about this, and it's not a comfortable conversation with consumers about the fact that there can be some drugs left, but they're safe. But this isn't true. There can still be antibiotics in there, and for tetracyclines, it can be there for quite a while because the evidence would suggest that it's bound up to calcium in the bone and then released during bone remodeling. So this is another one that we don't use oxytet or chlortet in human medicine, so therefore it isn't even an issue. And that one really makes me cringe. They use tetracycline not as much anymore, but they use doxycycline and minocycline and tigecycline in human medicine. And the other issue is that there can be significant cross-selection, so that some of these are able to select for other ones they're on plasmids or something together. But the building blocks of antibiotic resistance include antibiotic exposure, and then there's in the middle in the purple the ability to transfer resistance and the fitness cost of resistance. Up on the pathogen, there's the resistome, which means the resistance genes and the bacteria that are out in the environment, and then the fitness of those pathogens after they become resistant. And actually on Campylobacter, there's some evidence to suggest that fluoroquinolone resistance actually increases the fitness and the ability of that organism to compete in the environment. So that's rather scary. And the microbiota resistome and the environment resistome down there means the genes that are in organisms out in the environment and in the gut that are able to be selected for. So again, I think in closing, it's judicious use on the left, and applying those principles on the right makes it stewardship. What I think I might do, Heidi, is stop sharing mine and jump back to your screen so maybe I can see the chat box.
All right. So, well, thank you very much, Dr. Apley. I think you've definitely given us all a lot to consider, and it's always good, especially for those of us in production ag that don't have the pharmacology background, to kind of get different perspectives from other experts in the field. So, waiting on the chat box here for folks to type in their questions, and while they're thinking up their questions, let's start with your emphasis on those production practices. And you really emphasized that we have to have a defined plan for the use of antibiotics and monitor it. What would be the first steps for producers who don't already have that established?
So with the veterinary feed directive, one of the things it really did was establish the need for a veterinary client-patient relationship, and that has made it so that there's a required interaction between the client and the veterinarian. And so during that interaction, they're supposed to be discussing the needs, what it's being used for, and all those checkoff things on that slide they need to think about. And how the antibiotics fit into the preventive program and what's really required are incredibly important. So that interaction with the veterinarian, and yes, that might cost some money, but I really encourage people in production ag to look at it that if my veterinarian isn't able to return me value for time spent and money spent on those interactions, I can tell you there's a lot of veterinarians out there that can, and you should search for one of them. There's a lot of veterinarians that put a whole lot of time into continuing education and into talking with experts around the country to better their skills and their knowledge, and that's the whole thing that's driving towards, I think, is that interaction.
Okay. Along those lines, you point out some of those untrue statements, and even us in ag, we catch ourselves sometimes using those phrases where if we follow withdrawal periods, we don't have residues. Can you kind of elaborate on that? How can we better help ourselves communicate that fact?
Yeah, well, we do the withdrawal periods for safety and making sure that the animal will be able to be safely consumed. And those withdrawal periods are based off of tolerances. And the tolerances are based off of studies, for the majority of them, are based off of toxicology studies, where they first determine the NOEL, the no observable effect level. This is the highest dose which caused no problems in the test animals. And they go from that to the safe concentration in the edible tissues after determining the acceptable daily intake from the NOEL based on the average human weight. And it goes through these steps. So what we can tell them is that we observe the withdrawal times to adhere to the FDA approval process, where it says, this is determined to be safe. You could consume this amount every day during your lifetime and not have a problem. And then there's 100 to 1,000-fold safety factor figured in there. And then to boot, that's calculated to assure that only 1 in 1,000 animals might actually still be above tolerance at the time of slaughter. So there's multiple safety factors in there. I think that's how we explain it, that we're adhering to safety factors put into the drug label during the approval process And that's part of our production practices, is to adhere to those. To get into the antibiotic-free deal just takes us down a rabbit hole where we just really don't want to go. And I just think we need to stay away from the antibiotic-free claim on that and just stick to talking about the safety that we assure by adhering to the withdrawal time.
All right, well, don't see any questions coming in right now, so you must have done a pretty good job explaining the topic for folks.
Well, I was hoping to at least get someone wound up or something.
So I did put in the chat box for everybody. The webinar is being recorded today. In addition, Dr. Apley has also made a PDF of his PowerPoint slides available for your handout later, and it'll be on the website link there in the chat box. We typically get them posted about the next week, so you can kind of go back and check that, and previous webinar recordings will be there also. Our next webinar will be on March 1st at 11 o'clock Central Time, so you can use the same link that you used to log in today. And since I don't see any other questions coming in, I think that'll kind of wrap up today. If you have questions about this, Dr. Apley, you can find his information at the K-State faculty website, and he's more than happy to be able to address any other additional questions on antibiotic resistance and stewardship. So with that, thank you everybody for tuning in, and thank you very much, Dr. Apley, for your time and your expertise.
You're welcome. Glad to be a part of this.